State University. I think you have a handout. Did everybody get a copy of that? And this is going to be about the War Powers Resolution of 1973.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's good to be back here at LSU, Shreveport. I'll have you know that a flight attendant said, "Welcome to Chevy-port." And I'm not sure he'll be working from Delaware tomorrow. I want to offer my great thanks and appreciation to Bill Peterson, who's been running these conferences every troika years. I've been into so many of these, and it's good to be back here. I want to thank him and Melinda for all the work they did in preparing the conference. And the end of the last talk is a good segue into mine, because I'm here to discuss the War Powers Resolution 1973 and its author, Senator Jacob Javits. They've both been ranked in the top of legislation and legislators in American history by various polls. I come today with a little bit of dilemma. I'm a presidential historian, but I'm here to talk about Congress. Senator Javits himself was an institutional guardian of Congress, while at the same time a friend in many ways of Richard Nixon, who was one of his last supporters at the end of the Watergate scandal. And so when we think about this issue, and when we think about the Vietnam War, we have to look at some of the paradoxes. Personally, I gain more envy for Richard Nixon's Vietnam policy the older I get. And at the same time, we have to understand that he did not start the Vietnam War, and that other legislators who were there at the end were not there at the beginning either. But that qualifies, nonetheless, as an important area of focus, and that's what I'm here to look at. Senator Javits' biography is offered in my handout. What I would say is that I've served 3 positions in Congress, and the last of them was as an assistant to Senator Javits when he donated his papers to SUNY Stony Brook. I did everything from take out his laundry to book meetings with senators who acted like he was still in the Senate. He was once asked how many honorary degrees he had. He said 40. He was a recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1983, and as I mentioned, ranked as one of the top 10 senators in U.S. history. My friends, the next page, looking at the history of war powers, could take us till tomorrow, but I've been granted only 15 minutes to go over this presentation. So what I'll say about the history of war powers is this. If you read right now, in conjunction, Javits' What Makes War, and Michael Belschloff's Presidents of War, you really get the idea of the gist of a lot of my presentation. When we think of the American Revolution and the Declaration and its pertinence to the idea of war, we think of the concept of just cause, of consent of the government, of limited government, and of the ability to alter the government. That means by legislation as well as an amendment. In the post-revolutionary time in American history, we have to admit that because of the abuses of colonial governors, we were largely being run legislatively at both the national and state level. And of course, with Shays' Rebellion, there were serious complaints about the lack of military might at either the national or at the state level, whether in Massachusetts or anywhere else. And so we have to take that into consideration when we study the Constitutional Convention and the various plans for the convention. But more than that, what was talked about and what was agreed to about war. Who makes war? Madison originally used that as one of the powers of Congress. Congress would make war. And he and Elbridge Gerry eventually agreed to change that, to make it more specific. And so they changed it to the Congress would declare war. But that doesn't mean that they're out of the picture anywhere else. You know and I know all of the rest of the ways in which Congress is involved in raising troops and getting the Guard together and all the other ways that they do that. And so when we think of the wording of the Constitution, we can think of, as some do, the beginning of the Article 1, the legislative power. I was trained at the University of Virginia National Security Law Fellowship to retort that with Article 2, the executive power. The executive power, whatever you want to fill in, is the executive power. We have to think about those kind of interpretations of the Constitution. Or, just as the President faithfully execute laws, Senator Javits over and over and over again in Who Makes Laws emphasizes the retort, the necessary and proper clause, that trumps many of the areas of presidential authority dealing with war and the like. What we do know is that there were 5 declared wars, but hundreds of instances over American history where presidents have sent troops abroad into hostile circumstances. In some of those instances, Congress has got involved and authorized, and most of them they did not. We also know that the presidents have developed many tools over history, and I don't have time to go over how war was applied in all the American history, but what I can certainly say is that these tools were used by presidents over time to supplant Congress's authority, while at the same time Senator Javits accuses Congress of acquiescing and of abandoning their powers over time as well. What are these tactics that presidents have used dealing with war powers? Executive orders, emergency acts, executive agreements with deadlines, UN votes, treaties, deception, such as Belschloss's description of the Mexican War, the sinking of the Maine in the Spanish-American War, and certainly elements of the Gulf of Tonkin resolution during Vietnam. And loopholes in legislation, or claims by presidents of inherent powers, or signing statements, or as Senator Javits says, cumulative rhetoric of war, which one president picks up and the other one takes off, or simply the idea of hubris, which you get the feeling if you read Belschloss's book that really, Madison kind of just lost it there, and he opens the book by showing Madison looking at the fire as the British were burning down the White House. Wars are messy, and when you think of all of the wars that we've been in, we normally think of the fact that, well, if we won, everything was good. They're not. And that's part of what we're trying to deal with here. Who makes war? Both Congress and the President are involved in the war-making power. That's the message that constantly comes across. We also recognize that sometimes the courts get involved. They did not in the War Powers Resolution directly. I'll talk about that in a second. But you know and I know they have over time on occasion. And for each U.S. versus Curtis Wright giving the President authority in foreign affairs, there's a Youngstown sheet and tube limiting that. For every prize cases, there's an ex parte Milligan. For every Korematsu, there's an apology and reparations 40 years later. For every Hamdi versus Rumsfeld, there's a Boganin versus Bush. And I'm privileged to say that a law studies program at Delaware State University joined an amicus brief on a companion case, Al Oda versus U.S., in which we were consistent with the Constitution and the winning side in that case. And so courts have been involved over time as well. As we go in to look at the War Powers Resolution, I go right into the Nixon administration and Vietnam policy leading up to the resolution, but we have to think earlier than that. We have to think that there have been efforts on occasion by Congress to get involved more than they historically have in the war power. We have to think of, for instance, the Vietnam issue ever since Ho Chi Minh declared independence on September 2nd, 1945, and all the way up to the Nixon administration. Because as I mentioned, Richard Nixon did not start the Vietnam War. We also have to look at the previous history of war powers legislation that seriously was drafted and at least introduced during the Korean War era. And that's when the Congress first got involved in looking at the history of these forays with troops abroad that eventually the Congressional Research Service collected some years later, and still has. And we have to look at, as Senator Javits said, the impact of television on war coverage, and of course the fact that we had a military draft during the Vietnam War. But this part of my paper goes over the fact that Congress was looking toward the end of the war and was taking actions that were certainly trying to show their anger and their resolve on certain aspects of what was going on, like the Cooper Church Act following the May 1970 Cambodia invasion, or the effort to repeal the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1971, or early versions of the War Powers Acts that floated around in both the House and Congress, or the effort to stop the Cambodian bombing that occurred after the peace agreement in 1973 with the Case Church Act, or the fact that several members had sued the administration over its Vietnam War policy. And this was both before and after the peace agreement. Senator Javits notes that there were a dozen such lawsuits that were all rejected as political questions. One of them reached the Supreme Court, but it too got knocked down for that. And that there were several members involved in this as well. When we think of the actual circumstances of the War Powers Resolution in the fall of 1973, it reminds me of those bad last years that Jimmy Carter and George Bush Sr. had. In the fall of 1973, President Nixon was facing the Watergate scandal, the fallout from the firing of the special prosecutor, the resignation of his vice president, the Arab-Israeli conflict, and of course, for those of us who remember, the long gas lines from the OPEC oil crisis. And as an expert in the area of presidential vetoes, I can tell you that President Nixon's second-term veto legislation picked up in a rather record pace. In 1973, he issued 9 vetoes. 1, the legislation we're talking about today, was overridden, the War Powers Resolution. We pretty much know the issue of what the War Powers Resolution was trying to do, was trying to get the president to indicate ahead of time when he would commit troops abroad into a hostile situation that may be an extended period. He would then be asked to report within 48 hours and keep the president abreast of what goes on. Those troops could remain in country for as many as 90 days, but Congress must reauthorize the continuing action of those troops. And that was important to Senator Javits in his seminal authorship of the War Powers Act. To not do anything was not a congressional action in his view. So just as the other parts of the War Powers Act were important, so was that. And then I go over the actual chronology of the War Powers Resolution. We certainly have to recognize people like Clement Zablocki in the House of Representatives, who was one of the authors of the House version, and who fought with Javits and other senators over the legislation. It failed in conference committee the first serious time in 1972, and then of course it had to go through conference again during the next Congress, but did succeed and was passed. And we know President Nixon actually vetoed it in the last day he could have without it becoming law, without his signature, and that the veto was eventually overridden. President Nixon's veto messages claimed several arguments that the legislation was unconstitutional, undermining foreign policy, failed to require congressional action, and he proposed a sort of commission, which was an idea floating out there for a while, to try to deal with the issue of war powers and then report back to him. Both sides were kind of confident. The Nixon administration thought the veto was going to be sustained. Javits and his colleagues were pretty confident that they had the votes for override. I do a lot of work at presidential libraries. I dug out one November 7, 1973 memo from from David Parker to Al Haig. They wanted to have drinks to celebrate the sustaining of the veto. They never opened the liquor. Reactions to the War Powers Resolution. I've tried to bring that from both sides, and this comes from a book that goes over quotes in the 70s, and one of them came from U.S. Representative Thomas P. O'Neill, Speaker O'Neill, who in November of 1973 said if the president could deal with the Arabs and he could deal with the Israelis and he could deal with the Soviets, he he ought to be able to deal with Congress of the United States. Predictably, Senator Barry Goldwater, on the same day, he was at a rally, I think out in Idaho, offered the words that you see there, in which case he rejected that and argued that it would hinder and hamstring the president. We know over time there are a number of arguments against the War Powers Act, and that's why I posed the question, which I'll answer at the end. Go on in the New York Minute. Some people thought that it was, in terms of being ignored by successive presidents. The arguments against it are many, and they are both conservative and liberal. Conservatives believe the law is too restrictive on the president's ability to respond to foreign emergencies, while liberals say the legislation gives the president free rein to commit troops. And you know that there have been efforts to repeal the War Powers Resolution. There have been efforts to revise it, serious efforts in terms of various years. And I mentioned the Supreme Court case that dealt with that. In 2008, there was a bipartisan panel that recommended the repeal of the War Powers Resolution itself. But we know that it remains an important part of the American landscape and a warning to presidents to not get involved in the way that they do without the expectation that Congress would also be involved. Some evidence points to the fact that the War Powers Resolution has had the impact. Maybe not the one originally conceived, but there have been over 140 reports pertaining to the War Powers Resolution sent to Congress by presidents that the Congressional Research Service has documented. In most cases, they say consistent with. And if you're a constitutional law scholar, you might say that's not the language that actually says I'm adhering to it, but nonetheless, those are important to recognize. Or the fact that even if the presidents haven't cited the trigger time of the law, they're acting as if they, in some instances, that they are going by that time limit. The resolution certainly has served as a restraint on armed forces and has shaped American military policy in several areas. I've written about American responses to humanitarian disasters and about how that kind of intervention has to be dealt with militarily, particularly after the Somalia debacle in 1993. And we look at those aspects as well. But the most important thing for Senator Javits and others is that this law balances the constitutional equilibrium and brings it back to what he calls an appropriate balance or equilibrium between the two. And it promotes mutual accountability for the nation's most consequential actions. Javits himself, in his autobiography, which I quote toward the end, believes that this not only was significant as legislation for him, and he was a leader in the civil rights area, first senator to hire African American pages, first senator to hire woman pages. And yet in this area, he was an institutional protector of Congress and its rights. I'll finish with these observations. We have to understand that we're working within a constitutional republic. And for that kind of government, the authority over war can be especially messy, with principles such as checks and balances, establishing shared responsibility and accountability. That's the way it should be. Lives are at stake, and a country's honor hinges on its decision to start or end a conflict. For better, more than worse, the War Powers Resolution has aided in that perpetual debate. And I'd like to answer the question I posed at the beginning of the paper. Go on in the New York Minute. In answering in the negative, I'd like to offer the nomenclature of my wife, who's a Brooklyn native. Forget about it. Thank you.